In 1972, The Godfather made over $245 million worldwide and earned Marlon Brando his second Oscar at 48. He appeared for less than 1 hour on screen and changed acting forever. 7 years later, on the set of Apocalypse Now, he arrived overweight, unprepared, and had to be filmed mostly in darkness because the production could not rely on him. For nearly 30 years, he had practiced method acting, reliving real pain to create real emotion. But when you spend decades becoming other men, what happens when you can no longer find yourself? Marlon Brando did not just act, he altered the chemistry of cinema. In 1951, A Streetcar Named Desire introduced a new kind of leading man, raw, sexual, unpredictable. Audiences had never seen a performance that felt so close to a nervous breakdown. In 1954, On the Waterfront earned him his first Oscar at age 30. I Could Have Been a Contender became more than a line. It felt like confession. By 1972, The Godfather crowned him again, over $245 million worldwide, 2 Academy Awards. Less than 60 minutes of screen time, yet every pause felt intentional, every whisper calculated. Directors called him a genius. Actors studied him frame by frame. Method acting became the new standard because of him. But method required something dangerous. He didn't imitate emotion, he reopened memory, anger from childhood, rejection, insecurity, loss. For nearly 3 decades, he turned personal wounds into performances that changed history. The world saw transformation. What it didn't see was the cost of constantly tearing yourself open for the sake of truth. Long before he stepped into a rehearsal room in New York, Marlon Brando had already learned how to read a room for survival. He was born on the 3rd of April, 1924, in Omaha, Nebraska. His father was disciplined, critical, emotionally distant. His mother was creative and charismatic, but deeply alcoholic. Some evenings she was affectionate and inspiring. Other nights she disappeared into drinking, leaving unpredictability behind. For a child, unpredictability becomes training. Brando learned early to study tone, posture, silence. He watched for shifts in mood. He anticipated conflict before it surfaced. This sensitivity later became one of his greatest acting tools. He could detect emotional undercurrents others missed. But what serves as skill on stage often begins as defense at home. His father rarely offered approval. Affection felt conditional. Strength was demanded. Vulnerability discouraged. Brando later described feeling unseen and underestimated. That mix of rejection and expectation created tension. He wanted recognition but distrusted authority. He craved validation but resisted control. In school, that tension surfaced as rebellion. He challenged teachers and resisted discipline. At 16, he was sent to Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota. The institution valued order and obedience. Brando reacted with defiance. He violated rules repeatedly and was eventually expelled. Structure did not stabilize him. It provoked him. Yet beneath the defiance was hunger. His mother introduced him to theater despite her instability. Performance offered something different from home life. On stage, emotion followed a script. Applause replaced silence. He could channel anger without punishment and express vulnerability without ridicule. Acting did not just attract him, it organized him. When he moved to New York in the mid-1940s, he entered the dramatic workshop and later trained under Stella Adler. Adler insisted that acting must come from lived experience. Use memory, use pain, use truth. For Brando, this philosophy felt natural. He had a reservoir of unresolved emotion ready to be accessed. He did not need to invent insecurity or longing. He remembered them. This is where the line between talent and coping mechanism blurred. Brando's childhood had forced him to adapt by observing and mirroring emotional shifts. Method acting formalized that instinct. It turned survival skills into artistic technique. He became extraordinary at inhabiting characters because he had spent years adjusting himself to unstable environments. But there was a hidden cost. Reliving emotional memory repeatedly strengthens it. Neuroscience suggests that recalling trauma reactivates the same neural pathways. For Brando, performing anger, shame, or rejection did not dissipate those feelings, it reinforced them. As his career accelerated, the foundation beneath him remained unchanged. He had developed sensitivity and emotional depth, but not necessarily emotional stability. He valued freedom intensely. He distrusted confinement. Relationships that demanded structure often felt suffocating. The boy who grew up without reliable security became a man who avoided fixed structures. That avoidance shaped both his artistry and his personal life. On stage and later on screen, this volatility looked like brilliance. It felt authentic because it was authentic. Audiences sensed that he was not pretending. But authenticity in performance does not guarantee coherence in identity. If childhood taught him to become whatever the room required for survival, and method acting encouraged him to dissolve into every role completely, where exactly did Marlon Brando begin and the characters end? The foundation of his genius was built from instability. And if that instability was never resolved, was it only a matter of time before the method that made him legendary began to erode the man behind it? When Marlon Brando entered the actor's studio, he did not approach acting as craft, he approached it as excavation. Stella Adler had taught him that imagination must be rooted in lived truth. Lee Strasberg's Circle emphasized emotional memory. Brando absorbed the philosophy but pushed it further. He did not simulate emotion. He relived it. In 1951, A Streetcar Named Desire shattered expectations. As Stanley Kowalski, Brando did not deliver lines with theatrical precision. He mumbled, he paused, he sweated. He allowed anger to surface unpredictably. The performance felt dangerous because it was emotionally exposed. Critics described it as revolutionary. Audiences described it as real. That word real became his brand. 3 years later, On the Waterfront confirmed his dominance. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1955 at age 30. The famous "I could have been a contender" scene did not feel rehearsed. It felt remembered. Viewers sensed autobiography beneath dialogue. Brando's method was not about technique alone. It was about immersion. He altered his posture, breathing, rhythm of speech. He internalized psychological states so thoroughly that crew members often described him as remaining inside character even when cameras stopped rolling. Immersion created intensity. It also blurred boundaries. Unlike classical actors who stepped out of roles at day's end, Brando carried emotional residue. If a scene required humiliation, he would summon real memories of rejection. If it required rage, he accessed childhood anger. The nervous system does not distinguish between remembered pain and present pain. Each recall strengthened the original imprint. As fame accelerated through the 1950s, he became one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. Studios relied on his unpredictability as artistic currency. Directors tolerated improvisation because it produced authenticity. The industry rewarded his depth without questioning the internal toll. But depth requires constant descent. He avoided superficial performances. He rejected polished heroism. He gravitated toward characters wounded, conflicted, unstable. Stanley Kowalski, Terry Malloy. Later, Vito Corleone and Colonel Kurtz, men carrying internal fractures. Each role reinforced a pattern. Enter the wound, live there, deliver truth. Off camera, that approach complicated his relationships. Emotional immersion can heighten sensitivity. It can also destabilize mood. Partners described him as intense, charismatic, but unpredictable. The same emotional access that electrified scenes made ordinary life volatile. Method acting demands vulnerability, but it rarely teaches detachment. Brando rarely separated preparation from identity. If a character required loneliness, he isolated. If a character required moral conflict, he internalized it. The transitions were not always clean. By the late 1950s, Hollywood had labeled him both genius and problem. He challenged scripts, improvised dialogue, ignored conventional publicity expectations. He refused to maintain a polished image. He gained weight. He rejected discipline when it felt artificial. Some saw arrogance, others saw authenticity. But beneath those interpretations was a subtler reality. He had built a career on dissolving the line between actor and character. Over time, the distinction weakened. Performance gave him structure. Life required consistency. One he mastered, the other he resisted. The more he succeeded artistically, the more he depended on emotional excavation as fuel. That excavation kept childhood wounds active. It preserved volatility as creative energy. Audiences witnessed evolution in acting technique. What they did not witness was the cumulative strain of living inside unresolved memory for decades. If becoming other men brought him acclaim, what remained of Marlon Brando when the makeup was removed and the lights went dark? By the early 1970s, Marlon Brando had already changed acting once. Then he did it again. The 1960s had not been kind to him. Several large productions underperformed. Industry insiders questioned his reliability. Some trade publications even described him as box office poison. The narrative shifted from revolutionary talent to difficult liability. Then came 1972. The Godfather opened and rewrote cinematic history. The film grossed over $245 million worldwide and became the highest-earning film of its time. Brando, at 48, appeared for less than 1 hour on screen. Yet his presence defined the entire film. He spoke softly, forcing audiences to lean forward. He used stillness as intimidation. Every movement felt calculated, every pause deliberate. He won his second Academy Award. But the performance was not theatrical in the traditional sense. He had again relied on internal excavation. To play Vito Corleone, he lowered his voice, slowed his rhythm, and infused the character with quiet weariness. The patriarch did not shout. He carried memory. He carried loss. The power felt intimate, not exaggerated. Directors and actors studied him closely. Method acting, once controversial, now became mainstream. Emotional realism replaced polished delivery as the new standard. Brando was not simply succeeding inside Hollywood, he was reshaping it from within. Yet the spotlight intensified an existing tension. Fame requires repetition, public appearances, interviews, controlled narratives. Brando resisted these expectations. He disliked being packaged as an icon. He rejected publicity circuits. He openly criticized the industry's superficiality. In 1973, at the height of renewed dominance, he refused to accept his Oscar in person. Over 80 million viewers watched the ceremony as Sachin Littlefeather declined the award on his behalf. It was both political statement and symbolic rejection of validation. At the exact moment Hollywood reaffirmed him as king, he distanced himself from the crown. That decision reflected more than politics. It reflected fatigue. For over 2 decades, he had lived through characters by reopening personal memory. He had navigated praise, criticism, adoration, and resentment. The spotlight magnified every fluctuation. He was expected to be intense, profound, transformative. But sustaining transformation requires constant emotional exposure. He began withdrawing socially. He gained significant weight. He showed less interest in maintaining a consistent public image. Directors still admired his instinct, but unpredictability increased. On certain productions, he improvised heavily or altered scripts. Some saw genius, others saw instability. In 1979, Apocalypse Now reinforced both narratives. As Colonel Kurtz, he appeared largely in shadows, speaking about horror and moral collapse. The performance was haunting. It also mirrored a man who seemed increasingly comfortable operating in darkness rather than under bright lights. The spotlight remained powerful, but Brando's relationship to it shifted. He no longer appeared energized by dominance. He seemed burdened by it. The peak of influence had arrived. He had 2 Academy Awards, global recognition, and permanent impact on cinematic language. Yet the method that propelled him upward demanded continued excavation of pain. How long can a man stand at the center of attention when the fuel for that attention comes from repeatedly reopening his own unresolved wounds? By the late 1970s, the question was no longer whether Marlon Brando was brilliant. It was whether brilliance had begun to consume him. For nearly 3 decades, he had relied on emotional excavation as technique. He did not construct characters from the outside in, he dissolved into them from the inside out. Each role required memory. Each memory required reopening. That pattern intensified over time. Stanley Kowalski demanded aggression and sexual volatility. Terry Malloy demanded regret and wounded pride. Vito Corleone required restrained authority built on quiet sorrow. Colonel Kurtz demanded moral disintegration and philosophical darkness. These were not neutral emotional states, they were extremes. On the set of Apocalypse Now in 1979, Brando arrived heavier than expected and reportedly without full preparation of the script. Director Francis Ford Coppola adjusted scenes to accommodate him. Kurtz was filmed largely in shadow, partly as aesthetic choice, partly as necessity. The character spoke about horror, about the collapse of moral order. The performance was mesmerizing. It was also eerily reflective. Observers noted that Brando seemed increasingly detached from conventional structure. He disliked memorizing dialogue in the traditional way. He preferred improvisation, spontaneity, unpredictability. This approach could produce extraordinary authenticity. It could also destabilize production. The deeper issue was not professionalism alone, it was identity diffusion. When an actor repeatedly accesses unresolved personal memory, the boundary between lived experience and performed experience weakens. Neuroscientific research suggests that recalling emotional trauma activates similar neural pathways as experiencing it in real time. For Brando, anger or rejection summoned for a scene did not remain safely contained in fiction. Performance became repetition of memory. Repetition strengthened imprint. Over years, this loop can amplify emotional intensity while eroding stability. Brando's personal life during this period reflected volatility. Relationships were intense and often short-lived. He fathered children with multiple partners. Domestic structure remained fluid rather than consistent. Emotional presence fluctuated alongside career demands. He was extraordinarily perceptive about human psychology and art. Yet perception does not guarantee regulation. Emotional depth can coexist with emotional exhaustion. Weight gain during this era was not merely physical change. It symbolized retreat. Some colleagues interpreted it as indifference to image. Others saw self-protection, a deliberate dismantling of the sex symbol persona that had once defined him. The spotlight still followed him, but he appeared increasingly ambivalent toward it. Interviews became unpredictable, public appearances sporadic. He oscillated between sharp philosophical commentary and visible disengagement. The method that made him revolutionary required vulnerability without insulation. For decades, he had mined childhood instability for creative fuel. He had relived rejection to deliver authenticity. He had carried characters beyond the set. At what point does immersion stop being technique and start becoming erosion? The internal collapse was not dramatic at first. It was incremental. Fatigue layered over intensity. Detachment layered over brilliance. The same instinct that once broke cinematic rules now resisted structure altogether. He had proven that acting could be truthful. But truth without containment can become destabilizing. If method acting dissolved the line between character and self, what remained when the performance ended and there was no stable center to return to? By the 1980s, Marlon Brando no longer looked like the revolutionary who had electrified Broadway in 1951. He looked tired, not simply physically heavier, but emotionally saturated. For decades, he had entered roles by lowering defenses. He had trained himself to access vulnerability instantly. But constant exposure without recovery changes a person. The nervous system adapts to intensity. Ordinary life begins to feel muted, even empty, compared to the heightened states of performance. Several colleagues described him as brilliant in conversation, then abruptly distant. He could analyze philosophy, politics, psychology with precision. Yet sustaining consistent emotional engagement in everyday life seemed more difficult. The pattern extended into his career choices. He accepted roles that required limited screen time but large compensation. Superman in 1978 reportedly earned him millions for only minutes on screen. It was efficient, controlled, less immersive, a contrast to earlier decades when he would submerge himself fully. It suggested something subtle. He was conserving energy. But conservation came after depletion. The cumulative effect of years spent embodying rage, sorrow, regret, and moral collapse left residue. Emotional immersion does not vanish when cameras stop. It lingers in posture, in tone, in mood. Without deliberate separation between role and identity, the psyche can blur categories. Brando rarely spoke publicly about psychological cost in technical terms. Instead, he expressed disillusionment with fame and skepticism toward the industry. He described celebrity as hollow. He criticized Hollywood's superficiality. These statements may have been political, but they also hinted at fatigue. He had built his reputation on authenticity. Audiences believed him because he accessed real emotional memory. Yet repeatedly reopening unresolved pain does not close it, it reinforces it. As his physical health declined, his public appearances became more limited. The man who once commanded attention through intensity now seemed almost shielded by his own body. Weight and seclusion formed a barrier between him and expectation. Meanwhile, his influence expanded paradoxically. Younger actors adopted method as standard practice. Emotional realism replaced theatrical projection across generations. Brando's approach became institutionalized. But the originator paid a private price. Identity diffusion is not dramatic in a single moment. It accumulates through repetition. If an actor repeatedly becomes someone else, and if those characters are built from unresolved memory, the distinction between I feel and my character feels weakens over time. By the final decades of his life, Brando appeared less interested in inhabiting roles deeply, perhaps because he no longer needed to prove anything, or perhaps because the cost had become too visible. The method had produced revolution, it had reshaped cinema, it had earned 2 Academy Awards and permanent legacy. Yet it also demanded a lifetime of emotional excavation without clear boundaries. When a man trains himself to dissolve into every character he plays, what protects him from dissolving in his own life? Did method acting elevate Marlon Brando beyond his peers, or did it slowly erode the very center he was trying to express? By the 1990s, Marlon Brando was no longer competing for dominance. He had already altered the craft permanently. What remained was not ambition, but reckoning. He began speaking more openly about the illusion of fame. In interviews, he dismissed the idea that acting was sacred. He described it as a job, sometimes even as a trick. This was not false modesty. It sounded like detachment. The man who once dissolved into characters now seemed wary of dissolving at all. After decades of immersion, distance became survival. He accepted roles selectively and often for financial reasons rather than artistic challenge. The intensity that once defined him softened into calculation. He appeared less willing to excavate himself for every performance. That shift was subtle but significant. It suggested recognition of cost. Physically, his body had changed dramatically. Weight gain and health complications limited movement. Diabetes and cardiovascular problems became constant concerns. Public fascination with his transformation sometimes overshadowed his earlier work. Yet the physical changes also created separation. The former sex symbol was no longer expected to embody volatility or seduction. It allowed him to exist without constant projection. In private conversations and rare interviews, he reflected on vulnerability differently. Earlier in life, vulnerability had been a performance tool. Later, it became acknowledgement. He admitted that childhood instability shaped him. He acknowledged that fame complicates intimacy. He expressed regret without theatrical flourish. This period marked a quieter rebirth. Not a return to dominance, but a withdrawal from performance as identity. He spent more time in Tahiti, away from structured Hollywood expectations. The environment was slower, less scrutinized. There were no directors adjusting lighting to capture intensity. There were no scripts demanding excavation. For perhaps the first time, he did not need to be anyone else. The turning point was not one event, but accumulation. Years of immersion followed by fatigue. years of applause followed by distance. He had lived inside characters for so long that stepping back became an act of self-preservation. Interestingly, his legacy strengthened during this retreat. Acting schools treated his early performances as foundational texts. Directors referenced him as the moment modern screen acting began. Younger performers imitated his pauses and understatement without necessarily replicating his emotional risk. He became mythic precisely as he stopped trying to be transformative. There is irony in that. The more he withdrew from identity performance, the more permanent his artistic identity became. He no longer needed to prove authenticity. It had already been recorded on film. The rebirth, then, was not reinvention. It was reduction, stripping away expectation, accepting limitation, allowing silence without turning it into technique. He had spent decades exploring how deeply an actor could merge with a character. Now he explored something quieter, how to remain separate. If method acting required dissolving the boundary between self and role, perhaps wisdom required rebuilding that boundary. But after 30 years of emotional immersion, is it possible to fully recover the self that existed before the first role? In his final years, Marlon Brando was no longer a man chasing scenes. He was a man living with consequence. He appeared rarely in public. Health problems limited travel. Interviews were infrequent and often reflective rather than provocative. The intensity that once defined him now existed primarily in archival footage, preserved in black and white frames and dimly lit monologues. Yet his influence did not fade. Film schools continued dissecting his performances. Actors studied the way he paused before speaking, the way he allowed silence to carry tension, the way emotion seemed to rise from somewhere unforced. Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Jack Nicholson all acknowledged his impact. Modern screen acting, with its focus on internal truth over theatrical projection, traced back to him. He had permanently altered the grammar of film performance. But his legacy extended beyond technique. He changed how vulnerability was perceived in male characters. Before Brando, leading men were often controlled, articulate, externally composed. After Brando, hesitation, fragility, and emotional fracture became credible on screen. Strength no longer required polish, it required authenticity. At the same time, the complexity of his life remained inseparable from his legend. The weight gain, the reclusiveness, the family tragedies all became part of the narrative. He was remembered not only as revolutionary but as human, brilliant and unstable, transformative and fatigued. When he died on the 1st of July 2004, at age 80, tributes emphasized impact. Critics declared him the most influential actor of the 20th century. Directors credited him with reshaping cinematic realism. Actors described watching his early work as revelation. The performances endured because they felt lived, not staged. But there was another layer to that endurance. His career illustrated the cost of unfiltered authenticity. It showed how emotional excavation can create art that feels immortal, and how repeated immersion without separation can strain the person creating it. He left behind 2 Academy Awards, a filmography studied across generations, and a technique institutionalized in acting programs worldwide. He also left behind questions. Did method acting free him from childhood instability or bind him to it? Did dissolving into characters expand his identity or thin it? History will always remember Don Corleone's whisper and Kurtz's monologue about horror. But behind those performances was a man who spent a lifetime navigating the boundary between self and role. There is a scene in Apocalypse Now where Colonel Kurtz sits in darkness and speaks about horror as revelation. The camera barely reveals his face. His voice carries weight without volume. It feels less like acting and more like confession. Marlon Brando built a career on that feeling, the sense that something real was happening beneath the script. He proved that acting could be intimate, unstable, unpredictable. He changed the expectations of realism forever. But realism requires risk. For nearly 30 years, he accessed personal memory to give characters truth. He allowed vulnerability to surface without protective distance. The result was revolutionary cinema. The question that lingers is not about talent. His influence is unquestioned. The question is about cost. When you repeatedly become other men to achieve authenticity, how do you return to yourself? Brando demonstrated that performance can blur into identity. He showed that genius can emerge from instability. Yet his life suggests that without boundaries, immersion can erode the very center it seeks to express. He transformed acting by dissolving into roles. And in the process, he left behind a final paradox. Did he master the method? Or did the method slowly master him?